What's going on, guys? Today I want to talk about one of the most notorious floodgates available in H.A.T format, and as some would say, even potentially one of the most notorious floodgates in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, and that card is Vanity's Emptiness. This card at this point of recording has been banned for probably 8+ years at this point, and definitely for good reason. Now, in terms of H.A.T format, this is single-handedly one of the cards and basically one of the main reasons why a lot of players don't want to go back and try out H.A.T format or give it a chance, and that is because this card is at 3 in H.A.T format. But I want to try to talk about this card and talk about its legacy as well as where it sits currently in more modern H.A.T format, as I get asked about this card all the time, and you'd be surprised that this card actually doesn't see quite as much play as it did back in the day, and there's definitely some good reasons for that. So I wanted to talk about that and maybe convince some of you guys to try out H.A.T format if this is one of the reasons that you've kind of been scared to give it a go. And again, let's talk about the legacy of this card and everything like that. So let's start out with a little bit of the history behind Vanity's Emptiness. Vanity's Emptiness is a continuous trap card that says neither player can special summon monsters, and then if a card is sent from the deck or field to the graveyard, that you destroy this card. Now, this card was originally printed in Starstrike Blast as a common, and at first it wasn't, the most deadly of cards, not that many people saw use for it. But as the game actually progressed and years later, and special summoning became more of a mainstay in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card quickly rose in price and is notoriously also known to be one of the most expensive commons in a main core set, with Vanity's Emptiness as a common reaching prices of anywhere from $30 to $50+ for one singular copy. This card single-handedly could shut down so many different strategies during H.A.T format and the time that it was legal post-H.A.T format. Just to name a couple examples, you had the Dragon Rulers all legal at 1 copy each, and a simple interaction with Emptiness would be your opponent would attempt to summon a Dragon Ruler, banishing, whichever attribute or just dragons, and then attempting to summon this, at which point your opponent could flip a Vanity's Emptiness, and now you've lost resources and you no longer get a summon. Another thing, Trap Tricks, extremely powerful and prevalent in H.A.T format. Say you had a Mermail in graveyard and you go to normal summon your Dionea, attempting to bring back your Mermail to pop a back row and then potentially make an Xyz play, you could summon the Dionea and your opponent could flip Emptiness, and now you have a monster on board with 1700 attack, which isn't terrible, but you're locked out of special summons, and in a lot of cases you might not be able to out the Vanity's Emptiness. Other examples, for example, in decks like Sylvan, you had cards like Lonefire Blossom. If your opponent goes and summons Lonefire Blossom, tributes it for cost, you could then flip Emptiness and your opponent just lost a card. They have, at that point, potentially no monsters on board. Cards like Soul Charge, another card that is considered to be extremely broken, and one of the ways to combat this card is a card like Vanity's Emptiness. If your opponent goes to make a Soul Charge, maybe they really need to get back in the game, this was a way that Emptiness could be used. Your opponent activates Soul Charge, they target what they want to summon, and based on that, if you wanted to flip your Emptiness, it was a way to shut that down, along with other powerful cards for different strategies such as Sanctum, Call the Haunted, Geargia Gear, amongst a ton of other cards. Emptiness was just a way to completely stop all special summoning. Now, this became quite the problem, because the other thing with Vanity's Emptiness is it has the ability that if a card is sent from the deck or field to the graveyard, destroy this card, meaning you're able to basically activate this card on your opponent's turn, which would in theory stop them from special summoning, and then back on your turn, you're able to activate cards, say like Upstart Goblin, or, a handful of other cards that just simply get a card off of your field. Even something like a Mind Control in a sense. Say your opponent went for Dionea, You flipped Emptiness, your opponent passes turn, you now go Mind Control, the Mind Control will go to Graveyard, Emptiness will leave, and now you're able to special summon. So in a lot of cases, Vanity's Emptiness was just a way to stop your opponent from special summoning on their turn, as well as you're then able to go and special summon on your turn, which can be a complete blowout. Now, this card found a lot of use in decks, for example, like Noble Knight or Bujin, for example, decks that were kind of protect the castle, so you would put up a monster that's very hard to out, flip the Emptiness, and now your opponent has basically no way to out these cards, given a lot of these cards needed you to be able to special summon to actually out cards like this. For example, Bujin had protection from the graveyard in cards like Bujingi Hare or Turtle, and Noble Knights just would get very beefy and had equip cards that would prevent them from being destroyed once per turn, amongst other things. Another thing that Emptiness enabled was cards like Macro Cosmos plus Vanity's Emptiness would be an extremely oppressive combo. Now, keep in mind Macro Cosmos is at 1 in the format, but when paired with Vanity's Emptiness, Macro Cosmos says while this card is face up on the field, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Meaning if you had Macro plus Vanities, getting a card to go from deck or field to the graveyard in order to out the Emptiness was very hard because all the cards would be getting banished. So this would not trigger to get itself off the board. Another very interesting part of this card is people found ways in certain decks to actually lock this card and put it behind a boss monster, so even if a card would leave, this card would stay. So the main two candidates being Stardust Spark Dragon, that says once per turn, quick effect, you can target one face-up card you control. Once per turn, it cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects. So if a card were to leave, you could chain the Stardust Spark to the Emptiness and it wouldn't be destroyed. So in that case, your opponent would need multiple outs. Or a card like Master Key Beetle that has the ability that once per turn, detach a Xyz material from this card, target one card you control, except this card. While this card is face up on the field, that card or cards cannot be destroyed by card effects, meaning, your opponent would have to try to out the Key Beetle without special summoning because of the Emptiness. And, 2500 attack is nothing to shake a stick at. And as a result, Emptiness became one of the most powerful cards from this time period. Now, with all that being said, there definitely were outs during this time period to this card. For example, most commonly being cards like Mystical Space Typhoon, Trap Stun, or Wiretap. But all of these definitely had their own issues. For example, MST, you fall into the category of, say your opponent goes and MSTs your Emptiness, you still have the chance that if, say, Spark Dragon was on board or had you Key Beetle locked it still would not be destroyed. Then you have cards like Trap Stun, which while it could be good to turn it off for a turn, it could potentially turn back on, and even that can be used against you. Say, in another example, that your opponent had a Trap Stun and Emptiness, they flip the Emptiness on your turn, and then they flip their own Trap Stun, turning off the Emptiness for the turn, allowing them to special summon, and then, you can go off. It doesn't clear the Emptiness, and it can also be used against you in the case that I just mentioned. After that, there were cards like Wiretap, which would, when a trap card is activated, negate the activation, and if you do, shuffle that target into the deck, but that would require this to be set up before the Emptiness is live, meaning if your opponent went first and flipped Emptiness, the Wiretap wouldn't even be live at the time, so in that case, you'd rather have something like, say, an MST to actually out this card, and even then, it comes down to the debate of drawing the out, which isn't always the easiest thing to do, as we've seen in more modern times for a handful of different things. For example, Mystic Mine is another very notorious card that people would say, oh, just draw the out or something. And it's really not that simple. And that is kind of the history of why Vanity's Emptiness was so good back then. Now fast forward to modern H.A.T format, and here is an example of a first place deck Bujin that recently topped, I would want to say within the past week or two at the time of recording this. And as you can see in this deck list, Bujin being one of the main decks that would be able to take very good advantage of Vanity's Emptiness, you don't see it anywhere in the main deck. Even looking into the side deck, you also do not see it anywhere. Now you might be thinking, oh, maybe this is the one example. So here is yet another list. This one was from, I believe, a few events prior to that other list that also made a top spot. I believe it was somewhere between second and third, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or in general, it did top. And again, we don't see any Vanity's Emptiness anywhere in the list. And so I want to now talk about why that might be, and just in general, why Vanity's Emptiness feels like it kind of fell off despite it being such a powerful card. So why did Vanity's Emptiness actually fall off a bit in more modern H.A.T format? And in my opinion, there's a handful of reasons, but some of the main things come down to pricing, time, and testing. Now, for some people, this might be a little confusing, but in general, H.A.T format being 2014 is a time that is stuck in time. And what that means is, like any other past format, there is not going to be any new sets coming out that's going to affect the meta the way that Duelist Alliance came out after H.A.T format and completely changed up how the meta was, as well as we're not waiting on any other ban list at that point. Everything is stuck in time. And with that being said, over time, cards get reprinted and things like that. And as a result, the people who might have been priced out of certain outs for certain cards, for example, the artifact package was extremely expensive back in the day. Back then, thinking back, I was kind of young. I couldn't afford all of that stuff. If I wanted to play artifacts, I would have to borrow it. So mixing that with the idea that H.A.T format has been stuck in time, that means that people can playtest that format more and actually try out some of the cards and ideas that they might not have been able to afford back then, as well as just open their eyes to cards that are available that may have been overlooked. Just to name a few of those, obviously MST is a card that was cheap and affordable, and tons of decks played it all the time. But looking at a card, for example, like Artifact Ignition that sees tons of play in more modern H.A.T format, this card was very rarely played during the format in 2014. Part of the reason being the kind of dilemma that some players still face today, being you need to be able to set an artifact in order to actually pop a spell or trap with this, which if you don't play that many and you happen to see them, or it conflicts with your sanctums, then this is a dead card. But in more modern H.A.T, people have found that this card is actually really, really good, along with another card that I didn't show off here that pairs really well with this, which is Double Cyclone, another card that some people tested around with, but not that many people actually played because they found it to be a dead card if you don't see it paired with Ignition. So modern deck building has really affected the Vanity's Emptiness because now a lot of decks are maining multiple outs. For example, again, MSTs. Some decks are also on the Ignitions. Some people are also on the Double Cyclones. You still have cards like Trap Stun and Wiretap that both see play, and in general, these cards are good ways to out an Emptiness, as well as the hands being prevalent. Now, back then, hands were a bit pricey. I remember them being somewhere around like $10 to $15, $10 to $20 per copy, which can add up when you have to play multiple, but even the inclusions of hands being so prevalent, what you can do with the hands is, for example, say your opponent has a big monster on board, say something like a Yamato, for example, and you have something like an Ice Hand, what you're able to do is crash the Ice Hand into Yamato, and because you can activate the first part of the effect without needing to special summon necessarily, what you're able to do is activate the Ice Hand and pop specifically the Vanity's Emptiness, and then because the Emptiness is no longer on board, you would be able to summon the Fire Hand. Now, if you did this vice versa and say summon the Fire Hand and attack into the Yamato and use the Fire Hand to pop the Yamato, you would not be able to summon an Ice Hand because the Emptiness to send itself to the graveyard would happen after all of that resolves. But in general, now that's an extra way to actually out the Vanity's Emptiness. Besides that, people just kind of changed up their ways of thinking in terms of hand traps. DD Crow became a much more common card, and in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, DD Crow is a better card than, say, even Max C in Hat format, just because it hits so many things. Now, you're probably wondering, how are hand traps affecting Vanity's Emptiness? It means that going second, you have better outs to what your opponent is doing, rather than having an Emptiness that, again, is a trap card, so you have to set it ahead of time. And so cards like Max C, if your opponent's going to pop off, you might as well get card advantage from it. And in a lot of cases, that will just turn your opponent off of wanting to go and keep summoning, because they know you're going to keep getting advantage off of it. So, Max C is a great call against a lot of decks that are very rank 4 focused, or just can go into a lot of bigger Xyz monsters and stuff. Flying C is also another good option that is kind of floodgatey, having the ability that when your opponent normal or special summons a monster, you can special summon this card from your hand to your opponent's field in defense position. The controller of this card cannot Xyz summon. So in a way, you have better going second options, rather than, again, having an Emptiness that's going to be dead. The other thing is, in modern Hat format, you do have a lot of decks that are slower. You still have decks like Bujin. So what happens if you're playing against a deck that's on Emptiness and your opponent is on Bujin? Now you just have an extra dead card in your deck. Sure, Bujin plays cards like Bujin Carnation that can special summon, but it's definitely a deck that doesn't need its special summons, and if anything, in some cases, that might hurt you more. Other decks, for example, Mermail, have cards like Genix Undyne, which can send something like heavy infantry for cost, or a marksman if you have another set. In that case, you're able to, at bare minimum, even if they have something like a breakthrough skill to answer the Undyne, you're able to send the heavy infantry and pop the Emptiness, or you can send the marksman, pop another set card, and then the Emptiness will leave. Decks like Spellbook, sure, the Emptiness can stop the High Priestess, but Fate can still answer the Emptiness, and even then, it doesn't always need to special summon. You can win off of, Blue Boys and your Spellbook of Power and other resource loops that you have, as well as in more modern Hat, a lot of more rogue decks have started popping up. A prime example is the Spirits, which can gain a lot of advantage and doesn't necessarily need to special summon right away. It can play a more slow and grindy game. So going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of more different types of changes in deck building, here's a few more topping deck lists for more modern Hat to kind of show what I mean. So here's a Geargia list, a deck that, can play a slower, grindier game. It does need its special summons from time to time, especially this being the Karakuri version, which is a more combo-based version of the deck. But here you see in the main deck, while it's not on MSTs or anything like that, it is maining 3 copies of Trap Stun. And then looking into the side deck, we see 3 copies of MST. So again, if your opponent is on an Emptiness, you have main deck outs, as well as having more copies into the side deck. After that, here's another list, being a Constellar artifact deck, which is also a deck that has risen in popularity since 2014. Here we are seeing the 3 copies of Artifact Ignition, as well as the 2 copies of Double Cyclone in the main. So again, more outs to cards like Emptiness. And even looking into the side, they are siding an extra copy of Double Cyclone, which can definitely come up if they're seeing something like an Emptiness. Here's a Spellbook list. And now while Spellbook, again, it kind of goes back to what I said prior, but you do have cards like Fate that are recyclable that can easily out an Emptiness, and it's not even necessarily needed. Looking at their side deck, we see, again, MSTs being very prevalent and Malevolent Catastrophes that says when your opponent declares an attack, you're able to destroy all spell and trap cards. And so, again, just another way to really have a lot of back row destruction so that you aren't blown out by cards like Emptiness. Again, here's a Mermail list that, again, has your infantry, it has your marksman. In the side, it has MST Guarantees and Malevolent Catastrophes. Just more ways to really go and actually out back row. Now, even with all of this being said, Vanity's Emptiness, while it might not see as much play as it used to back in the day, it definitely is still around, and it is a card that occasionally you will run into. And part of the reason that is because you still have the powerful locks with Stardust Spark Dragon and Master Key Beetle. Now, one thing to note with this is usually when you do see Vanity's Emptiness, it's definitely more common that you find it in the side deck, specifically when you know you're going first, because Vanity's Emptiness is, as I mentioned prior, it's not that good of a card when going second, unless, you open a perfect hand, you can break your opponent's board and set it up, which honestly isn't really the case in Hat format in more modern times, given how grindy decks really can be. But in general, yeah, you will still see Emptiness from time to time, and usually it's going to be in those decks that can protect it with Spark Dragon or Master Key Beetle. So for reference, here is another most recent Hat format tournament. First place was Hieratic Ruler, and here we do see the 2 copies of Vanity's Emptiness in the side. So, again, when you know you're going first, you can definitely side these in, and this is a deck that can very easily put up something like a Spark Dragon to protect it, so you definitely have that. And then the same player topped another event, this time, though, with Evil Swarm, and Evil Swarm is an example of a deck that can take advantage of Vanity's Emptiness due to cards like Master Key Beetle, again. So it's definitely in the format, and again, while this is the same player, there are other examples of people going and siding the Emptiness, but you never really see it too often in the main. Occasionally you'll see it in, say, Infernity or something like that, but even then, Infernity doesn't see as much play as it used to in 2014. Personally, I could definitely see Vanity's Emptiness making a little bit more of a comeback in Hat format if, for example, Hat format gets a lot more attention and popularity, simply because a lot of people, as I mentioned, remember this card being so notorious, and as a result, they might throw it in their decks just because they remember how powerful it is without really realizing the way that the format has sort of changed. So I could see it seeing a rise in play, as well as there could be new innovations found in Hat format to make this card even better, because it already does have a solid start. And again, it is a very powerful card. But in general, this was just my opinion, and I wanted to talk about this, hopefully convincing more people to actually give Hat format a go, because it is a very fun and diverse format, and I think that people just don't give it the time of day. But anyways, if you want me to make a video like this for any of the other cards that people might consider to be really broken or a turnoff from actually trying Hat format, you can definitely let me know in the comment section down below. And in general, let me know what you think of how Hat format has developed and what your takeaway from this video actually is. Definitely, again, comment that in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this video, it would really mean a lot if you would drop a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, and anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.